ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Before I start my talk, I really want to thank Claudia for inviting me to Vicenza and giving me that opportunity to talk in this really terrific meeting. It's always a pleasure to be here. Now, talking about coagulation and anticoagulation, I think we often forget that clotting is the Achilles heel of any CRT. And this is even more important when we are developing, with all the technology, the more complicated forms, adding, for example, gas exchange membranes and so on. So I think anticoagulation is essential, and we sometimes need to forget it, tend to forget it. Why is this a problem? Whenever blood is coming into contact with the membrane, then you have activation of the coagulation system. There are kinogens we are attaching to the membrane, and you get the classical activation of the coagulation system via the intrinsic pathway on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the extrinsic system by activation via tissue factor, which may come from macrophages, but also from microparticles, which may carry tissue factor on them, and this activates the coagulation system. But then you have also inflammatory reaction, which is mediated by activation of complement system, which leads to the activation of neutrophils. They are releasing platelet activating factors, which activate the platelets, which is again stimulated by sludging of the erythrocytes, which release ADP and further stimulate thrombocyte or platelet aggregation. And this starts a feedback cascade via a GBP2B3A receptors and fibrinogen again connecting, and this enhances the cascade. So we have an activated system, both coagulation and also inflammatory parts, and where we can intervene is either giving heparins or heparinoids, intervening with mainly factor 10 and thrombin and previous parts of the cascade. We can give direct thrombin inhibitors, which mainly go to inhibit thrombin, and we can try to inhibit the platelets additionally or only alone, but this has largely come out of fashion because of high pricing and low efficiency. And then what we can do is just eliminate all the calcium which is necessary for all these processes, both for the coagulation process and for the inflammatory operations, by giving citrate, chelating calcium, and thus stopping all these processes. So anticoagulation is a balance between providing optimized filter or circuit survival, which some say must be at least 24 hours. Others tend to have longer survival or want to have longer survival, like 72 hours. And on the other hand, you want to minimize the risk of bleeding, which is reported between 5 and 25%. Now, we have different forms of anticoagulation. Generally, you can consider systemic anticoagulation, where the patient is completely anticoagulated. But usually when we are using an extracorporeal system, you can add the anticoagulant into the extracorporeal system. And so you do a low-grade systemic anticoagulation because the anticoagulation effects in the patients are lower than in the extracorporeal system, which is usually when you're using heparins, heparinoids, or thrombin inhibitors and giving them to the extracorporeal system. On the other hand, you have regional anticoagulation, either by giving heparin and neutralizing heparin at the end of the circuit by giving protamine sulfate, or by using citrate for regional anticoagulation. As we heard before by Marlis Osterman, most people do not anticoagulate, which where I completely agree with George that we should anticoagulate the patients. But the most frequently used anticoagulant is still heparin. When you use how it's produced, it's majorly extracted from tissue, like big bowels. It's purified, and then you have a huge range of molecular weight sugar molecules, partly binding antithrombin capabilities. The half-life of heparin is very short. It's around 1 hour, and the price is very low. That's why people like to use it. And the other advantage is that it is quite easily to be monitored. What we have to keep in mind is, since the effect is mainly on factor 10 and on thrombin about 50-50, and this effect is also mainly dependent on antithrombin. You don't have any heparin effect or largely decreased heparin effect if you have low levels antithrombin. As I said, it's easy to monitor by using PTT. And as I said, I think most people are using heparinization as a low-grade systemic heparinization. This is due to the fact that when you start using low doses of heparin, you get dramatically reduced rate of coagulation in the system, whereas the rate of hemorrhage is very slowly increasing, and then also at higher values it's going exponentially up. So you tend to stay in the lower range of the systemic anticoagulation, have the extracorporeal system anticoagulated. Why does this work quite well with heparin? As I said, heparin has a large range of molecular with large sizes of up to 30,000 and small sizes. And the large sizes are cleared by the reticular endothelial system, whereas the small sizes are cleared by the kidney by filtration. And when we have acute kidney injury, these small sizes are increasing more than the large sizes. So you're having a better anticoagulative effect in the extracorporeal system, even if PTT seems to be quite low. As I said, you have to remember if you're using heparin, you need adequate levels of 83. This has been shown in this comparative cohort trial where Dijon added 83 to levels above 70%, and then they could show that they have a dramatically increased filter survival when using heparin. This is an issue. I think that when using heparin, we have to keep in mind that we have quite frequent incidents of so-called heparin resistance, which is partly due to a lack of antithrombin, which is consumed or proteolyzed on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have a lot of unspecific heparin binding to other sites than just in the coagulation system. So it's binding to necrotic cells, and it is also binding to acute phase proteins. So you have an inactivation of heparin, and you might need higher doses to get adequate anticoagulation, in addition to the fact that you need antithrombin. And I don't know what I did now. Sorry. And the next thing is that heparin is not neutral in terms of inflammation. It has both pro and anti-inflammatory action. So heparin is influencing our inflammatory system. How about the low molecular weight heparins? I think they are more neutral. And the other difference to unfractioned heparin is that the direct action is mainly against activated factor 10. You see you have a relationship of 4:1 in activity against factor 10A versus thrombin, and it is not dependent on antithrombin, so you have a quite independent action of low molecular heparin. There are different other advantages of low molecular weight heparins, that you have a lower incidence of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, and you have less activation of platelets and less inactivation by platelet factor 4, and has no metabolic side effect and is quite constantly bioavailable. There are some disadvantages of low molecular weight. It's just an increased half-time, which is already higher than unfractionated heparin, but it's getting even higher if the kidney is failing. And you need anti-10A monitoring, which is a little bit more complicated and somewhat more expensive than PTT. And you can only partly antagonize it by protamine. However, you can do the same as you do it with the heparin. You can put low molecular weight heparin inside the extracorporeal circuit, and then you get low systemic anticoagulation and high extracorporeal anticoagulation, as we showed in a trial years before, where we put enoxaparin in the extracorporeal system. And you can see here, this is the anti-10A activity in the extracorporeal system, and this is the patient activity, and you see it's much higher in the extracorporeal system, and even 24 and 72 hours later, this relationship remains constant, and it's not accumulating when you are monitoring the dose via factor 10A. So you have low systemic anticoagulation and all the benefits of low molecular weight. Heparin, which led to significantly increased filter survival of 50%, lower costs, and the same rate of bleeding as you had with low-dose heparin. So low molecular weight heparin seems to be a little bit more effective, and you can see this in dialysis patients when you're looking at the membranes treated with low molecular weight heparin as compared to unfractious heparin. You just see it, obviously it's improved. In case of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, you cannot go with heparins. You have to switch to alternatives. One alternative is danaporoid, which is a mixture of heparin, damraton, and chondroitin sulfate, but it works pretty much the same as low molecular weight heparins. You can monitor anti-10A activity to dose. The problem with danaporoids is they have an extremely long half-time, which is still further going up when the kidney is failing and you have some cross-reactivity. That's why generally nowadays it's recommended to go to direct thrombin inhibitors. And there are two major players. One is agatropan, which is primarily metabolized by the liver, and the other is bivalirudin, which is hydrolyzed and needs neither the liver nor the kidney for elimination. But it's not registered for use in CVVHE, and it's highly priced. So agatropan is the substance of choice in heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. You can monitor it easily, like heparin with APTT. You have to consider that it tends to have higher anticoagulation effectiveness when the patient has a diminished liver function or is in liver failure. So this is the major caution by using this substance. So when you look at the picture, unfractionated, low molecular weight heparin and citrate, and you see that's good, better, best. Citrate seems to have the optimal protection, provide the optimal protection of the membrane, at least in this 4-hour dialysis period where you see just the clean membranes of citrate. And that's why citrate is becoming so popular. It's working by chelating calcium, I told you before, which inhibits all the steps in the coagulation system. Basically, to show you the principle is you are giving citrate at a fixed certain rate to the blood flow, so that you get a certain level of citrate within the blood, which you can determine by measuring the ionized calcium in the extracorporeal system. Calcium and citrate are eliminated somewhat by the filter, depending on the filtration rate, the dialysate flow you're using, and the rest of the calcium citrate is going back to the patient, and you're giving calcium for the loss of the calcium in the filtration with the citrate. And it's a little bit more complicated in terms of monitoring. You have to monitor the patient so that ionized calcium is not going below a certain threshold of around 1, endangering the patient. And the other thing is you have to repeatedly check the circuit so that it is adequately anticoagulated. And then you have to check the metabolism of citrate, see if pH is staying stable, and if you have any indication of accumulation, which would be reflected by an increase of the ratio of total calcium versus ionized calcium. So it is a little bit more complicated. You need more tests, and you have to be more aware of possible complications. And as I said, your citrate clearance will depend on because it has a very low sieving coefficient like that of urea. It's completely eliminated by filtration or dialysis. So if you are increasing your ultrafiltration rate, you're also increasing citrate clearance, and you have to keep that in mind. Now, this is a very nice system because the extracorporeal circuit is anticoagulated. The patient is not anticoagulated, so have real, true regional anticoagulation with its caveats. What we mainly have to consider is that citrate has to be metabolized. It's mainly metabolized in the liver, and it gives us free molecules of bicarbonate by metabolizing citrate. it has a very short half-life time. So within 5 minutes, it should be eliminated. So usually it should not accumulate as long as the liver is working adequately. Now, there have been 3 recent trials which were looking specifically at the specific group of patients with liver failure or liver impairment, and I think these studies are important. That's why I'm showing that to you, because that was a major limitation for citrate application, that if you have liver failure, that would be a contraindication. These are the worst patients. These are the patients in complete liver failure who are needing molecular Mars system, so sort of a liver replacement system, and you see that has been used for an average of 20 hours in this study from Vienna. The patients have been considerably sick with a dramatically reduced prothrombin time of 36% and elevated bilirubin thrombocytopenia. We see the platelets stay more or less stable. They're a little going down. This was the only major significant change, but what was interesting is, and this is the ratio which indicates accumulation, is that you have some accumulation in some patients, so about 20% in these patients with complete liver failure, but the other patients even are going well over the 20 hours without accumulating. Now, this is the Mars system, and it's only 20 hours on the average. So it would be much more interesting what is in patients with liver failure on continuous venous hemodialysis or hemofiltration. It has been investigated with CVVHD in this study from Germany, where they looked at 43 patients, 43 runs in 28 patients, and they were aiming at 72 hours, and they were achieving this aim in 74% of the patients, and none of the treatment had to be interrupted in the first 24 hours. There was some accumulation in the patients, and they were analyzing who are the patients with the highest risk of accumulation. It's those who have the lowest levels of prothrombin and they have the highest levels of lactate. So if you have patients with increasing lactate, this is a risk patient, which is not suitable then anymore probably for citrate. And then this was the latest trial looking at patients with impaired liver function, where we also were contributing a significant amount of patients, and we were investigating 133 patients. About a third had normal liver function, a third had diminished liver function with a bilirubin between 2 and 7, and a third had liver function which was more impaired with a bilirubin above 7. And what you can see is that in terms, this is start and the end of the treatment, in terms of metabolic stability, this is the arterial bicarbonate. It was going up as it was expected in all patients, and the pH remained quite stable until the end of the treatment. In terms of filter survival, those patients who had not to be interrupted, for example, for investigations or for going out for diagnostic investigations, most of them had a 72 hours filter survival. And in terms of accumulation, you can see this is the calcium dose. It is increased at the beginning, which is mainly due to because most of the liver patients tend to have lower ionized calcium at the beginning of the treatment, but then they are stabilized in all 3 groups. These are the colors of the 3 different groups, so it was pretty well tolerated in these patients, and only 3 cases had a calcium accumulation, which is in a range of 2% of the whole cohort. Now, how often would we experience accumulation of citrate? And this has been done nicely here in sort of a cohort study, a retrospective cohort study from Germany by the Slavinsky group, and they did an additional sort of systematic review. And when you can see, these are the works of CVVHD, and there have been more or less some patients with liver insufficiency, some patients with normal liver function. But what you can see is that the rate of citrate in accumulation is in the range of 1 to 2, at maximum 3%. So it is happening, but it's a very low rate, and if you're cautious, you can manage it. And the interesting thing about that study is also that those patients who accumulate have a very high probability of dying. You see, these are the accumulating patients. They have only 20%, 28-day survival. So it's a biomarker of patients who will probably not survive, those who are accumulating citrate. Now let me end the discussion about citrate with two recent meta-analyses. I don't want to go into the single trials, and I think they have to be mentioned. They are addressing very interesting aspects. So I think there's no doubt about that the circuit survival is better when using citrate as compared to heparin. This has been shown in this meta-analysis for patients with systemic anticoagulation. And it has also been shown when citrate was compared to regional anticoagulation, heparin and protamine sulfate. However, this study was mainly driven by the very recently published study by David Gattas, and they could show that as compared to regional anticoagulation using heparin and protamine sulfate compared to citrate, that the citrate is performing much better, and they had an improved median circuit life, which was about nearly 100% better than the regional anticoagulation with heparin protamine sulfate. So I think there's no doubt about it that both using systemic anticoagulation with heparin or low systemic anticoagulation or regional anticoagulation, the citrate is providing better filter life. There seems to be some differences in terms of the modality when you're using it. The effect was very well pronounced in CVVH. It was clearly seen here that you have highly significant improvement in survival, in filter survival. On the other hand, there was a large variation in CVHDF, and it's a lower number of trials, but overall the effect is clear. You have an improved circuit survival independent of the method, and is in the range of 15 hours at least. So I think that's a significant effect. And there's another thing that was quite interesting in this meta-analysis, that in pre-dilution you seem to have more effect of citrate versus post-dilution. I don't know if it's just because of the method, if this is a mechanical issue. Now let's go to adverse effect, and I think this is very important. Bleeding, and I think this is important for surgery patients, is significantly reduced with citrate as compared to any form of heparinization. And you have a significantly reduced rate of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia when using citrate. So citrate is better in terms of adverse events and better in terms of circuit survival. How about adverse effects of citrate itself? I told you before that we have some citrate accumulation we have to look for in the range of 2%. And the other thing is that hypocalcemia is more frequently occurring in patients with citrate, but this is obvious. This is the inherent in the method. Finally, back to the first large trial on citrate versus heparin coagulation. This was the Helen Ottomans trial, which was the first trial which showed significantly improved survival in patients treated with citrate. This was always sort of an idea behind that citrate might be beneficial in terms of survival, and there have been additional small trials after Helen's trials, always in the range of 100 to 200 patients. And they are now summarized in this meta-analysis by Liu and co-workers, and as you can clearly see, now summarizing all the randomized controlled trials on citrate versus heparin anticoagulation, there seems to be no beneficial effect in terms of survival. However, what is very interesting in that study, they added a trial sequential analysis for mortality. So in addition to conventional borders, they calculate how many patients would be necessary. So when the decreasing boundary for benefits and the increasing boundary for futility start to meet, and their calculated minimum sample size would be 1,021. So still, with all these trials available, we are not having reached this number, but at the current situation, the numbers are here. So it's only a little distance left for this border, and it doesn't look seriously. It doesn't look like we will have a beneficial effect on citrate on survival. So this leads me to the end of my talk, ending actually with the recommendation of the KDIGO guidelines, which are here written in detail, but I will summarize it for you in the last slide to make life a little easier. I think one thing is interesting for continuous renal replacement therapy. Citrate was recommended as first line unless there is a contraindication for citrate. And as I showed you before, the real contraindication for citrate are very small, very little situations, and the numbers is quite low. So let's summarize. So if you have a patient who is already on systemic anticoagulation or has a severe coagulation disorder, patient can be done renal replacement therapy, no anticoagulation. If there is no increased risk of bleeding in intermittent hemodialysis, heparin seems to be the mainstay and it is also recommended, whereas in CRT, citrate has been recommended at with higher grade of evidence as compared to heparins. If the patients are an increased bleeding risk, then you can do intermittent hemodialysis with no anticoagulation, but of course you can do it with citrate if you do it in the dialysis units. Since we heard before from all the benefits, it is a clear indication for citrate if you have a patient with increased bleeding risk. Finally, if you have a patient who is suffering from heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, you have to use thrombin inhibitors because of the systemic effect, and the direct thrombin inhibitors are clearly preferred to other factor X inhibitors, which have the problem that they are accumulating in renal failure. So I hope I could give you an overview. Thank you for your attention.